Well, we have entered that stage in the spiraling decline of the Trump presidency when every day now something happens in the public rooms of the White House that we have never seen before. Yesterday in the cabinet room, it was Nancy Pelosi standing up to Donald Trump as no one has ever stood up to him before. Nancy Pelosi was doing what Donald Trump's parents apparently failed to do. She was teaching a spoiled brat a lesson. Nancy Pelosi stood up to Donald Trump in a way that no one who has ever worked for Donald Trump has ever done. She did something Donald Trump's wives are not allowed to do and his children do not know how to do. And 24 hours later, it was Mick Mulvaney's turn in the White House press briefing room to do something we have never seen before and say things we have never heard in that room from a White House chief of staff.
The president wants to fire me today and hire somebody else he can.
The president must be thinking about that right now, tonight, as he watches this show and other cable news shows and sees the overwhelmingly negative news coverage and commentary about Mick Mulvaney's soiling of the White House press briefing room today. The Washington Post reported this afternoon that one person who spoke to Trump said that he was pleased with Mulvaney's performance, but that was before Mick Mulvaney was forced to release a written statement in which he attempted to rewrite what he did today in the White House press briefing room. And what he did at that microphone in the briefing room was implicate the president in possible crimes, and while he was at it, implicate himself. There is already a federal criminal investigation of what Rudy Giuliani was doing in Ukraine and what Donald Trump was telling him to do in Ukraine that could involve criminal violations of campaign finance law that makes it a crime to solicit help in a political campaign from a foreign country. Donald Trump clearly did that in the rough transcript of his phone call with the president of Ukraine, where we see him soliciting help from Ukraine by asking the president of Ukraine to investigate Joe Biden, by name, Joe Biden. But today, Mick Mulvaney identified another law that he and the president may have broken.
The Budget Control Act, Budget Control Empowerment Act of 1974 says if Congress appropriates money, you have to spend it.
Okay. Thanks for reminding us. In the same press conference where Mick Mulvaney reminded us that it's against the law for the president to block spending that Congress has authorized and appropriated, Mick Mulvaney said this about the $400 million in aid Congress appropriated for Ukraine. Quote, "We cut the money off. We held up the money. We were holding up money." Mick Mulvaney is one of those Trump world characters who speaks as if he has not heard what he himself just said. And so here is what Mick Mulvaney said about why he and the president held up the money.
Did he also mention to me in the past the corruption related to the DNC server? Absolutely. No question about that. But that's it. And that's why we held up the money. Now, there was a report.
So the demand for an investigation into the Democrats was part of the reason that he ordered to withhold funding to Ukraine.
The look back to what happened in 2016 certainly was part of the thing that he was worried about in corruption with that nation. And that is absolutely appropriate.
Absolutely appropriate. The same guy who at the same microphone told you it is against the law to hold up the money tells you it's absolutely appropriate. And then he tells you how you should feel about all this.
And I have news for everybody. Get over it. There's going to be political influence in foreign policy.
And much to Mick Mulvaney's surprise, that didn't help anyone get over it. Republicans did not rush to the microphones to say, "Thanks, Mick, that clears that up. Thanks for helping us get over it." Adam Schiff, the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, actually left the deposition that he was conducting today with one of the self-labeled three amigos of the Trump-Ukraine conspiracy to say this.
With his acknowledgement now that military aid to a vital ally, an ally battling Russia, as we speak, was withheld in part out of a desire by the president to have Ukraine investigate the DNC server or Democrats or 2016, things have just gone from very, very bad to much, much worse. The idea that vital military assistance would be withheld for such a patently political reason, for the reason of serving the president's reelection campaign, is a phenomenal breach of the president's duty to defend our national security. And I hope that every member, Democrat and Republican, will speak out and condemn this illicit action by the president and his chief of staff. Thank you.
The Washington Post reports officials close to Trump were infuriated by Mulvaney's comments during his news conference that essentially acknowledged a quid pro quo under which Ukraine would receive aid in exchange for helping with a Justice Department investigation that might benefit Trump's campaign. One Trump advisor calling it totally inexplicable. He literally said the thing the president and everyone else said did not happen, the advisor said. As Democrats and Republicans in Washington were reeling from what they just saw Mick Mulvaney do, even Attorney General William Barr apparently decided he wanted no part of what Mick Mulvaney was selling today. And so an unnamed Justice Department official began telling news organizations the Justice Department doesn't know what Mulvaney was talking about. A senior Justice Department official told NBC News, quote, "If the White House was withholding aid from Ukraine with regard to any investigation by the Justice Department, that's news to us." Mick Mulvaney is going to be fired. That's what happens to all Trump White House chiefs of staff. It's going to happen. Mick Mulvaney's firing is now simply a question of timing. Will the impeachment process leave Donald Trump in the White House long enough to fire and replace Mick Mulvaney? Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.